So if your total is about 1,200 pounds right now, and every time you go through meet prep, you end up stuck about 3 weeks out where your body's just too sore to really hit your top sets reliably, I want to show you the exact method that I use with a lifter to take him from this exact situation to hitting his most recent PRs, a provincial qualifying total, and more PRs a couple months later. And so what I'm going to describe to you here is what I call an intensity sensitive lifter, okay? And so what we find, the situation here is that they'll go through their peaking block, and in the off season things go well, they can hit a bunch of rep PRs, but as they get closer to the meet, the heavier the bar weight gets, the more they just feel banged up. And if you want my help with hitting some new PRs and managing a lot of these recurring aches, pains, and injuries, you can just click the link down in the video description below, and I'll get in touch with you directly to see how I can help out. And so in my time coaching powerlifters full-time since 2014, I've seen lifters who've been literally so banged up that they can squat or deadlift once a month after meet prep because of the amount of pain they're in, to national podiums and doing it in a pain-free fashion. And so the situation that I'll see is with this very specific type of what I call an intensity sensitive lifter, right? They'll run a peaking block. The first couple of weeks are gonna feel pretty manageable because they're generally starting conservative, right? If you've got a 6-week peak, 6 weeks out, probably not going to be super heavy weights. You're going to try to build nearly into meet day with a taper on week 5 and week 6, right? And commonly, especially with the squat and deadlift, your glutes and upper back and kind of like that region right there, technically it's your SI joint, but there's a lot of other stuff going on, will start to accumulate. So if you think about it as like first couple weeks you're okay, week 3 you start to feel a little banged up, week 4 and now you're 2 weeks out and you're having to pull back on your top sets right as prep is getting heavy. Not because the strength isn't there, but because you're worried that you're gonna make things worse and then really hurt something where you're not gonna make it through to meet day. And getting stuck in this like damage control situation is really hard when you're in meet prep because you can't just stretch out a training block or take an extra couple of weeks to recover because they're not gonna move the meet date for you, right? And so you end up kind of sandbagging and you pull back and then you hope things are there on meet day, but you ultimately end up stuck in this situation, in this constant cycle of wondering like why you're getting stronger in the gym, why you keep getting really banged up in prep, and then why meet day feels like a gamble. And so the issue with this is really in how a conventional peaking block is structured, okay? So in a conventional peaking block, everything's gonna get heavier at the same time, right? You're gonna say, okay, well, I'm gonna use sets of 5 and 6 in my strength blocks. I'm gonna use sets of 8, 10, and 12 in my hypertrophy blocks. And in a peaking block, I'm gonna really heavily prioritize triples, doubles, singles, and really push the intensity on those. And so if you think about this like a scale, okay? If this was your scale and you had your main work here and your secondary work over here, let's say you did squats and high bar squats, like low bar and high bar. And low bars here and high bars here, and then you start to peak. Well, this is balanced initially, but as your low bar gets heavier, we're pushing to this end of the spectrum, and then your high bar moves a little heavier as well, and then suddenly, we start to fall out of balance, and that's where you feel like you're a couple weeks out and you've just been like hit by a bus, right? And all those old injuries flare up, and like that upper glute on the right side or your left lower back starts to creep back in, and it's not a happy, right? So I want to give you an example of a lifter I work with named JR, and he's very much one of these intensity sensitive kinds of lifters. And I want to walk you through the block that we actually did that led to him qualifying for provincials, which is the same as a regional qualifying total here in BC, and how we actually hit more PRs a couple months later with this same kind of strategy. And so quick background on him, big injury history when we started working together, even when he was in his early intermediate phases of strength, like 2-plate bench, 3-plate squat. He was very much still getting banged up when he got close to PR weights. And at his most recent meet, he squatted 440. Now he got red lighted on depth, which is its own issue, but it was close enough and fast enough where I'd argue, okay, we were there, and knowing how training went, we're on a good track. And the reason that I'm qualifying this depth thing is because a couple months later, we ran the same strategy and he hit 463 to depth. And that was a really big squat PR. This is ultimately like 20 kilos up on his squat PR from where we had started prior to this year. And the big thing with the style of meet prep cycle that we went through was that he just wasn't destroyed after hitting the 200 kilo squat in January of this year, where if fast forward a couple months later, we were just kind of able to go into another block of training and continue to see things move upwards. And what's really interesting about that 210 kilo squat, the 463, is he did it at an RPE 8.5. Like he just buried it and he smoked it. It was really cool. So let's talk specifically about what that prep actually looked like, okay? So on his primary squat day, I'll pull up a couple screenshots here. We started his three-week peaking block with a target of taking a small PR based on how his last meet went and how training was going. So we figured, hey, 5 kilo PR is gonna be probably a good number to shoot for, and then we work backwards from there, right? We said, okay, 205 is our target, but the catch with this is we can't just throw a bunch of heavy singles at JR, and we know that he builds strength really well with his block reviews. If we hang out in that RPE sort of 7 range, typically around 70 to 75% of his max. And so typically most of his programming looked like a bunch of sets of 5 in that 70 to 75% range, which is definitely not good enough for peaking. And so what we said is, okay, well, this is where we build really well and you don't get banged up and you can hold good momentum. How do we transition that to the skill of lifting heavy weights and singles? And so all we did is we replaced 2 of his sets of 5 with a couple of singles. Sub-max, but working backwards from that 205 kilo target goal, we said, okay, 2 singles a week, like a single at a 6 and a single at a 7 RPE, is not gonna really bang you up, but it's gonna get you enough weight to feel the groove so you don't get rocked back on your heels when things get really heavy. And so we took 185 kilos on week 1, we took 195 kilos on week 2, and then week 3 we tested, and instead of hitting 205, we hit that 210 where things moved really, really well. We talked about the primary lift, but we still need to go through the balance side of things. So like, what are we doing with the other lifts? So we have tier 1 movement, competition lift, tier 2 movement, his secondary, and tier 3, which is like generally hypertrophy work for him. So for JR, typically speaking, his tier 2 movement is actually gonna be a machine-based quad movement, but we wanted a little bit more skill focus to emphasize positioning in his peaking block, because it works really well for just keeping a groove. But we can't go super heavy because then we start to get that out of balance issue. And so the solution we found was manipulating the difficulty with tempo so that the intensity wasn't super high. So what you'll see here is we ended up running 3 count pause squats, and I mean 60 beats per minute metronome, count 3 clicks in the bottom, and running that at about 60-65% of his daily max. Now, on paper, really low percentage to do for sets of 3-4 reps, but it's hard enough in the bottom because of the isometric contraction you're creating, where we were able to get more squat exposure, more skill practice without beating him up as much. And then the last thing we did to create a little bit more room, so again, going back to this scale, instead of moving everything this way, we just create more spread. So his main squat does get a little heavier, but we pull a little lighter on everything else. And we just changed the RPE on his volume work for his quads with his belt squat, instead of being RPE 8 to 9 to the same amount of total reps, but pulling him back to about RPE 7 just to maintain what he had for one block. It's not gonna kill him. It doesn't move the needle forward, but we're just creating a little bit more room to prioritize recovery towards the main lift. And that's like one of the big changes you can make in a peaking block, where you're gonna prioritize top end performance over momentum. And that's gonna be a little different with each lifter. And so when you stop trying to take this idea of like a block structure with everything, where everything moves in one direction, and instead you work on maintaining balance within your program, it allows you to really get more creative with how you manage recovery and keep the goal of the goal. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter in the belt squat example or in his pause squat example how much he lifts with those, as long as his performance on the main lift goes up. And this is where it can be hard to look at managing like recovery versus building base strength and how that changes block over block, right? With JR, this kind of strategy of stretching and creating more polarization worked super, super well, where even a few months after his last meet, he blew that missed 441 out of the water, where he did it at a 7 on his peaking block on the testing day. And then we added 5 more kilos. So instead of going at 102.5%, we squatted 105% of his max at RPE 8.5, right? Which makes me really, really excited, because we've got provincials coming up here in August. And I feel like there's gonna be another big squat milestone to be had at that meet, right? Especially with the extra adrenaline you get on competition day. And so ultimately, like, the reason I've been able to identify a lot of these trends with lifters, right? And intensity versus volume sensitive and when to polarize versus when to have everything mimic the same kind of patterns is because when you work with enough lifters, you can see all this kind of stuff. Whereas when you're self-coaching, you're always going to be limited by how many things you can do at once. And so in working with a coach as a lifter, you can leverage that and literally buy faster progress because you can get rid of a lot of the unnecessary trial and error and become very pointed with the experiments that you run. And so if you're tired of that constant experimentation and just failure to really link up the exact building blocks that you should be doing in your block, and you want to get from trial and error to pointed experimentation and results at your next meet, you can just click the link down in the video description. I'll reach out directly and we'll chat a little more about your training to see how I can help you out with hitting a really big total at your next meet.